Hey everybody, it's the Teddy Rose Show. I'm Theodore. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm going to go over rebuilding my bottom end for my E83 X3, aka Becky. 2.5 is coming out and a 3 liter is going in. Now what I'm doing here isn't anything new. I learned this from my father at Metric Mechanic. I've got the Woodruff key cutter and my main cap set up on the mill so that way I can machine in a single Loctane groove to use 325E main bearings on my M54 build. The reason for that is to make sure that the oil feed hole from the main bearing to the rod bearing is constantly fed from a full 360 oil groove. It just so happens that the M20 shares the same rod journal and main bearing dimensions as the M50 family of engines, M54 as well, and the US S50, S52. The M54 3 liter uses the same crank, an 89.6 millimeter stroke, from the US S52 as well. To be clear, this is a nice modification for someone that's racing and is maybe worried about oil supply to the rod bearing. But this is overkill for my build. I don't need to do this, and I'm not suggesting that you have to do this. I'm just showing this as an example, something to consider. Bearing clearance is important, and as you notice from when I machined the Loctane, the Woodruff key cutter left a little rolled, raised area, and I've got to file that down to make sure that the cap is perfectly flush to the block. The main bearing I'm using here is a Glyco brand of standard dimension. It comes from the M20 2.7 ETA engine, as it's referred to. I also go through all the bearing shell thicknesses and measure them down to the 10,000ths. When I go to measure my main bearing and rod bearings, if I've got something too tight or too loose, I can refer to the back side of my shells where I write the number and see if I need to adjust them from there. Sometimes you need some extra packs of bearings too. Before I installed the crankshaft, before I decked the block, I actually went through and put 14 helicals in here to alleviate a few fears. I don't know the life of this engine. I don't know if when I go to torque the head down, are the head bolt threads going to pull out? You got fears sometimes. It's a slow, tedious job, but very rewarding, and I'm a glutton for punishment. I kind of enjoy doing it. Also, I'm not a DIY video kind of guy. I'm just trying to get comfortable with putting myself out there and just showing people what I do. This is not like you need to build your engine this kind of way type of thing. Nope. So the helical kit comes with a specific tap for the inserts. Be sure to use it. Do not use a standard 10x15 tap. There is a difference in dimensions. Teddy, note to self, don't get excited and get ahead of yourself and skip machining steps. Next time, before you hone, insert the block. Now I got a mess to clean up here. Just another friendly reminder, be sure to use that helical tap provided with the kit. Now I want to go over some dimensions and lengths. The time cert is 23 millimeters. It's not a true 25 millimeters. The helical, it's not a true 30 millimeters. That's what I'm using here. It's actually 26 and a half, roughly 27 millimeters. The outside diameter is just a little bit bigger too on the helical versus the time cert. My preference is a helical in this job. I know some people like to use time certs. That's cool. Either way, I think it's important to have a little bit more thread engagement. I got an extra M54 engine here that's beyond repair. At least I got a few parts out of it. But I wanted to illustrate how much wall thickness there is behind the head bolt hole. And once you go from a 10 mil to a 12 mil, because that insert's going to be 12 millimeters, if it fails and you've got to go to something like 14 millimeters, the likelihood of cracking certain areas in the block is really high. So be warned. I use so much Loctite. Everywhere I use Loctite. Red, blue, green, purple. I love this stuff. I love Loctite like soy sauce, and I put it on everything. Note to self, break that tab off on the bottom of the helical when you're done. After I'm done, double checking everything and making sure I don't forget those little tabs at the bottom of the helicals. The glass bead machine is loaded with a fine 120 grit. The idea is to clean the surface, not damage it. Now, I had made a mistake here when I decked my block. I didn't do the front cover. I know better, and I should have done that. I'm real thankful that we have some jig fixtures here, so that way I can set up a front cover and get the height exactly where it needs to be. It's crucial that the deck surface for the front cover is not plus or minus to the block. It's got to be 0 on the money. You don't want any leaks in the head gasket. Even though I had to backtrack, I got it on the money. I spy out of the corner of my eye. There's so many crickets in this shop. I'm doing my part. So I'm real fortunate this worked out for me. I work for a company called Metric Mechanic, and we primarily do performance engines. We had some leftover stock Goats rings and Molly rings where I was able to piece together a set of rings for my engine build. The Goats rings came from an early M50, and the top compression ring was wrong. It's 1.5, needs to be 1.2. The Molly ring set has an oil ring that is a single piece design. I don't like that style. I prefer the 3-piece design, which is what's in Goats or Hastings. So it's cool. I ended up with a set of rings from 2 different brands, no problem. The Goats rings were too loose. They were like around 20-22 on the ringing gap. And of course that top ring wouldn't fit because it's from an earlier M50 engine. So I kind of lucked out here. I got the oil control ring that I want. And although 15-16 is a little loose on the ringing gap as a result of me honing out the engine, it's acceptable enough. I'd rather be a little loose on the ringing gap than a little tight. Now that everything is cleaned, measured, weighed, and appropriately assigned to each cylinder, it's time to install the rings. I stagger the ringing gaps 180 from each other from the pin side. The instructions may say something different. That's just the way I've always done it. I got this machined perfectly. I've already done this before, but I just wanted to show, and it doesn't hurt to double check, that the block is as flat as fill in the blank. Loctiting in my oil squirters for that extra peace of mind. I don't want them ending up in the bottom of my oil pan. And no, I am not worried about them falling apart. Time to measure the big end bore of the rod just to make sure things are circular and nothing's out of round. And I've got some extra bolts to fasten it down. After I'm double checking my rod big ends, I'm going to go through and measure all these bearing shells with a micrometer that has essentially half a sphere on one end, so that way you can measure a curved surface. Just to clarify, I use both imperial and metric systems. I go back and forth between inches and millimeters quite often. Like on the main caps, I've written the clearance for the main bearings in inches, although I'm measuring it with a dial bore gauge that measures in millimeters. The Matoyo happens to have a smaller head that fits within the main bearing section, so that's why I'm using this one. But I generally go back and forth between the imperial and metric system quite often. Mounted up the steel plate on the aluminum block with the magnetic base dial indicator to check the front of the crank for in play. One thing I need to mention is that when it comes to stretch to yield bolts, such as the crank main bolts or rod bolts, head bolts, etc., I've got 2 types of bolts that I'm using. One set of bolts for all the mock-up stuff to be able to make sure my measurements are correct, and then the other set of bolts that are the final bolts that go in the build. Crank spins nice and free, feels good. It's a relief when you've got your oil pump taken apart and you don't see any major scores or gouging inside the housing. The gears look good. So that feels good. I'm just going to give the gears a nice little polish and clean everything up. Glass bead, pull the pressure relief valve out. The pressure relief valve can actually be shimmed up if you are looking to increase oil pressure. Again, this is not a race car. I'm not trying to do that. I probably should, though, because down the road, who knows, I might put a turbocharger on it. Oh, I say that and I'm going to jinx myself. Anyways, the oil pump is looking good, and it's time to finally get the bottom end together. Yes, I am aware of the upgraded oil pump shaft by Achilles. No, I will not be using it. I don't think it's necessary for me for a bunch of reasons. Oil pump's done, pistons and rods are assembled, bearings are mic'd out. Let me double check, but I think everything's ready to go together. This little notch on the side of the rod is intentional. It shoots oil right underneath the wrist pin. Some rods have one notch, some have two, some don't have any, and that's for both sides. I was always taught to stagger the ring and gap 180 from each other by Steve Kempenaar and of course my father, Jim Rowe. That's the relief for the oil squirter on the intake side, and that is the lock tank which goes on the exhaust side. Always trying to keep in mind the assembly code to how things are supposed to be put together. I've used ring compressors a bunch of times, but these sleeves from Wiseco are absolutely the best. They've got a tapered inside diameter to be able to compress the rings nice and evenly as you drive the piston in. You just got to make sure you get it squared in that bore. As a part of that assembly code, rod caps and rod big ends have corresponding numbers that match each other together. And then also, just as a friendly reminder, for the bearing shell, it's loctane to loctane. It's been said to not use ARP lube underneath the head of a bolt. Well, here I am doing that. In fact, there's probably quite a few things you'll see that you won't agree with that I'm gonna do. Sorry. I use the factory torque specs for the rod bolts. A chamfer at the top of the cylinder also helps guide the rings in, makes it a little smoother. oil pump sprocket and then move on to the crank hub and get all this hard plastic crap off of there. So I can get the chain nice and tight against the sprocket, I'm going to use some shims for the oil pump so that way I can tighten up the oil pump chain. The wavy washer helps set up the reverse thread nut to the correct height so it doesn't bottom out past the threads, and it also provides a locking capability for the nut and the sprocket coupled with some red Loctite. This makes me feel incredibly confident that I'm not going to have an issue here. No, I don't need to weld the nut to the sprocket or wire tie it. I'm good. Yep, Loctite everywhere, even in unnecessary areas such as the rear crank seal housing. Once I've got that sealed up and installed, then it's time to get the bottom end to TDC. That's at cylinders 1 and 6. The reason I'm getting this at top dead center, true top dead center, is so that way when I put the degree wheel on at the back of the crank, I know where the piston is at all times when I go to set the cam timing. The video is getting too long. I think it's time to shut it down. I could not have gotten this done without the Metric Mechanic team and facility. And thank you so much for lending your time and watching.